Hey, good afternoon, everybody. I hope you're all having a great day today. And I think it's safe to say for a lot of us that our interest in the Civil War really started when we were kids growing up watching Civil War films. So, this past summer, when distance learning was all the rage, our good friend and partner, Jared Frederick, went ahead and made a video where he discusses what he thinks are the top five most important Civil War films ever made. Now, Jared is a professor at Penn State University. He's also an author. He used to be a park ranger at Gettysburg, and he's also been featured as a guest for the Turner Classic Movie Channel, so he really knows his stuff. So we hope that you're able to take some time out of your day and enjoy this video.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jared Frederick, and I thank you for joining me today as we take into consideration what we could think of as perhaps the five most important films that discuss the American Civil War. Students often ask me what the best Civil War movie is, and that's a very difficult question to answer because ultimately, your favorite Civil War film is up to you. Beauty is in the eye of the beholder, so to speak. However, what I can speak to is what we should think of as perhaps the five most important films that look at America's deadliest conflict. And so, in a very quick manner here, I'm going to take us through a very quick ride through cinematic and Civil War history alike, and we'll see what we come up with. Perhaps the most obvious place for us to begin our cinematic journey is with the 1915 blockbuster, a controversial one at that, entitled The Birth of a Nation. This was meant to be director D.W. Griffith's saga as how he interpreted the American Civil War and the time period that followed that was known as Reconstruction. And despite its very controversial standing in cinematic history today, it was widely accepted as gospel history in 1915 and the 1910s and 1920s when a lot of American audiences were going to watch it. From a technical and cinematic standpoint, it was absolutely groundbreaking, and people lined up around the blocks to see this film. However, despite its cinematic achievements, its history by our standards today could be considered a little bit more lackluster and unbecoming, especially in regard to its racial depictions regarding slavery, Reconstruction, and particularly the depiction of the Ku Klux Klan in the film. And in this movie, Klan members are depicted as the white avengers of the South, trying to rectify this issue of Reconstruction. And it feeds into all of the lost cause mentalities and perceptions of the war and Reconstruction that largely indicated that African Americans were giving these rights that they were unprepared for. And this horrible period of misgovernance and miscarriages of justice ultimately followed. This is what the main theme of The Birth of a Nation was. And as it turns out, going to show just how important movies can be in changing our perceptions about the past as well as our current standing, the film served as a big boom to the Ku Klux Klan. The Klan reinvented itself as a result of this film. And by the time we get into the mid-1920s, the Ku Klux Klan is one of the most powerful organizations in the United States, boasting over 6 million members. President Woodrow Wilson held a private screening of this movie in the White House where he purportedly said, "It's like writing history with lightning. I only regret that it is all so terribly true." This showed the power of cinema at this early age of Hollywood history, and it would ultimately take a long time to rectify that issue. And one could make the argument that The Birth of a Nation delays the civil rights movement by the better part of a century. A film that follows up on a number of these themes, although in perhaps a slightly less volatile way, is the biggest movie of all time, and that is Gone with the Wind, which comes out in 1939 at the tail end of the Great Depression. Of course, this was based off of Margaret Mitchell's international best-selling novel of the same name. and the leads of Clark Gable and Vivian Leigh, who we can see here on the screen, were cast in the lead roles. And when Gone with the Wind was released in December of 1939, it became nothing less than a cultural phenomenon. And through 1939 and 1940, over 120 million Americans went to see this film. That was essentially every grown adult in the United States at that time. And it resonated among audience members for a number of reasons. Many characters were able to be sympathetic with somebody like Scarlett O'Hara. And when she raised up her fists in defiance and she says, "I'll never go hungry again," that is something that struck a chord with a lot of people in Great Depression America. They likewise did not wish to go hungry ever again. And much like Scarlett, they wished to rebuild their lives. They wanted to rebuild their own version of Tara, this mythical plantation that Scarlett O'Hara lived on. Gone with the Wind 2, over the years, has faced a number of historical criticisms by those who study such things. And chief among them, once again, is the depictions of slaves in the film. The slaves are depicted as contented and even worse yet, childlike. Although it was somewhat tempered in contrast to what was originally in the novel, it nonetheless received some fairly harsh and perhaps justified criticism on the part of African American audiences. Nonetheless, it became the biggest movie of all time, and when adjusted to inflation, it still is the #1 film ever at the box office, even beating out the likes of more recent films like Avatar and Titanic. And perhaps most importantly, what Gone with the Wind does is it further solidified this interpretation of the Moonlight and Magnolia's plantation myth. And it perceived the plantation as a romanticized, idyllic place in the broad scheme of things. And that is one of the big historical legacies that Gone with the Wind ultimately left behind. And eventually, it would take the better part of a half a century in order to steer Hollywood movies in the other direction. Such was the great of Gone with the Wind's influence. And 50 years to the month of Gone with the Wind's release, we see #3 on our list, the 1989 Edward Zwick film, which is entitled Glory. Glory is the story of the 54th Massachusetts Regiment, one of the first all African American units to fight on behalf of the Union during the U.S. Civil War. And it aptly demonstrates how they had to fight 2 wars at once: the enemy within, racism within the United States military, while also fighting the Confederates. Although the majority of the characters in the film are fictionalized and hybrid characters, the main character, Robert Gould Shaw, played very well by a young Matthew Broderick, really shows how a regiment came into being. And even if it does take some liberties with the story of the 54th, it is a very accurate reflection of the African American experience in the Civil War, and it also shows how Civil War soldiers developed bonds of camaraderie in combat, as well as other struggles that they confront throughout their military service. And according to actor Morgan Freeman, one of the great legacies of this film is the fact that it raised awareness throughout American society. Most citizens had absolutely no clue that Black soldiers had fought in the Civil War. Theirs was a history that had long been neglected and overlooked, either accidentally or purposefully, throughout the long range of history. And this certainly rang true at the 1990 Academy Awards, in which Denzel Washington received an Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor for his incredible performance in Glory. And at his dedication speech, Denzel Washington said, "I would like to pay homage to the soldiers of the 54th, the black soldiers who helped make this country free." And rhetoric like that was certainly never seen at an Oscar ceremony prior to that, nor was it hardly ever seen in Civil War movies as a whole. And this is why Glory is such an important film, not to mention its stunning and violent scenes of combat, including the climactic assault scene in the film on Fort Wagner in Charleston, South Carolina. As we continue to move along our timeline, we're going to give an honorable mention, a bonus feature of sorts, to Ken Burns' PBS documentary series, The Civil War, which comes out the year after Glory is released. This might otherwise be featured in a top 5 list, but if we look at it in its formal standpoint, this is not a movie. It did not show in theaters. It is a television documentary series. All that said, it too, like Glory and other films that would follow, had a profound influence on how Americans looked at the Civil War, and even more importantly, it generated a lot of interest in America's bloodiest conflict. Over 30 million people tuned in these weeks when it aired in 1990. So 30 million people watching a documentary. Not too bad. And it also helps fuel energy for the next film on our list, and that is 1993's Gettysburg, number 4. And I like to refer to Glory, Ken Burns series, and the movie Gettysburg as the trifecta of Civil War films, if you will. And those 3 productions, they gained a lot of steam and attention in the early 1990s, really set the stage for getting a lot of young people interested in history, myself included. I was in grade school when I began watching a lot of these films. And had it not been for those films, I might not be here before you talking about them right now. But of course, the movie Gettysburg, widely celebrated, much beloved by many people in the historical community, is based on Michael Shera's 1974 novel, The Killer Angels. And what makes this movie unique in a number of regards, not only is it the longest movie ever released in American theaters, ever, but it was also filmed on actual battlefield locations within Gettysburg National Military Park and throughout Adams County, Pennsylvania. It used almost entirely a cast of reenactors who were volunteers who did this out of a love for the story, a love for the history, and I think throughout much of that film, the dedication really shows. And it makes it a richer film as a result. There's hardly any CGI or gimmicks as such in that. It is all practical effects. It's all real people. And in my view, that's one reason why the movie has aged so well. This was thereafter turned into a television miniseries, which aired on TNT in the year 1994. And it received a similar acclaim and welcome among TV audiences, as did Ken Burns' film. Somewhere around 35 million people watched this when it aired as a miniseries. And perhaps unsurprisingly, the visitation to Gettysburg National Military Park bounced up by over 100,000 the following year, most likely as a result of this film. It also got a lot of people into the hobby of reenacting, which set huge trends throughout the 1990s and the 2000s in the historical community. Last but not least, on our list, we have a movie that comes out 9 years after Gettysburg. That is the 2012 film directed by Steven Spielberg entitled Lincoln, in which one of the greatest actors ever, Daniel Day-Lewis, portrays the beleaguered 16th president in the final 3 months of his life, as he is not only contending with the conclusion of the American Civil War, but also trying to struggle and pushing forward the 13th Amendment to the Constitution that will end slavery. Now, the case with many of these films, and almost all historical films, is that these movies tend to be reflections of the time in which they are made as much as the historical time periods that they represent. Such was the case with A Birth of a Nation, and such is the case with Lincoln. It comes out in 2012. And one of the themes that we see in this movie is really the notion of acceptance. And how is the United States going to become a broader society that appeals and looks after a broader and increasingly diverse number of Americans? And I think those were themes that rang true just as much in 2012 as they did in 1865, albeit under somewhat different circumstances. And so in all of these films, ultimately what we seek is not only entertainment, but we seek relevance. We look to history for direction, and therefore we often look to historical films to serve as a compass along those lines. And most certainly, the movie Lincoln did that. It too became an Academy Award winner, and Daniel Day-Lewis made history, there as well. He became the third actor to receive a Best Actor Oscar as a result of his performance in this film. And the movie was released the same week of the anniversary of the Gettysburg Address in 2012. And Steven Spielberg gave the keynote address at Dedication Day in Gettysburg. And in his speech, he said that he had never been more humbled to speak anywhere than in Gettysburg, giving an address, only yards away from where Lincoln had given his most famous speech. And I think this ties things together very well because it shows us the power of place, and I think it also alludes to the significance of historical preservation. Movies can inspire us. They can also misinform us in some cases. We as humans tend to read one book for every 10 movies that we watch. And so one may ask, how can true history win when most people get their history from Hollywood? Well, I think perhaps the best way to answer that is that movies can be a foundation toward a broader understanding and a bigger appreciation of the true historical picture. And certainly that was the case with me. I suspect it might be the case with many of you as well. But I would urge historians, rather than being perhaps too overly critical of some more modern movies, to embrace the opportunity to use them as a touchstone for discussion, getting people interested, raising their consciousness about the past, and that in turn is how we can evoke historical stewardship and encourage it on a far broader level.